Okay, good evening, everyone. So we'll start. We'll start now. We've got 73 people on the call at the moment. So tonight is a Q&A session, and this really started off because I watched the TV program that was on the other day with Alice Roberts and Mike Parker Pearson, and I was remembering some of the questions that we've had in during talks, and sometimes those questions were not really for the speaker. There was something much more general that wasn't really on the topic that the speaker was talking about. And I suddenly thought, well, I'm sure lots of people are as confused and sort of as many questions hanging as I've got after that TV program. So I thought, well, why not do a Q&A for our members? And I thought 20 people, 25 people, that would be fine. But as you can tell, there's a few more than that. And also Mike, Matt and Katy were rash enough to either volunteer or be volunteered to help with the to sort of help with this. And so it just seemed like a really great idea. So thank you very much to them for taking part. Now we've got a few questions lined up, a couple of some of which, well, you may have seen them, but we'll start with one that was sent in advance, which I think is quite interesting, which is, with the latest evidence suggesting a whole extant circle was moved from Pembrokeshire to Stonehenge, is there sufficient evidence from the Stonehenge environs, I don't know how to pronounce that, to suggest the move was part of a bigger event, the migration of a whole tribe, group of people? Or is it more likely it was simply the move of a ritual object, or 30 odd ritual objects, as the case may be? Now, who'd like to have a crack at that first?
That's such a huge question. I mean, because
you'd like that one.
Sort of,
I thought you would like that one.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, it presumes so. It assumes so much. I mean, the first thing is that we can talk about what the evidence actually is that a stone circle was moved from Wales to Wiltshire, and I'm sure Matt and Katy will have something to say about that as well. But just on regardless of whether the stone circle went walkies, on the question of whether there was some kind of great movement of people from Wales to Wiltshire, I think that is highly unlikely. We've got evidence that's very suggestive coming from all sorts of directions now of contacts between the Stonehenge area and the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, where most of the bluestones came from. What the nature of that contact is, we can only guess, really. I mean, we're in theoretical areas here. It's not something that archaeology that we have at the moment really gives us enough evidence to say what's going on. But for example, the first thing, obviously the headline thing, is we have all the bluestones at Stonehenge. The argument that they reached Wiltshire or Salisbury Plain or somewhere near Salisbury Plain in glaciers from Wales, I think is really dead. So we can leave that one to one side, at least for our conversation we can. So people have brought these stones. That's a mammoth undertaking, even if it's not something that happens all at once. In other words, we can't take it for granted that all the bluestones were transported from Wales into Wiltshire at the same time. But that's one thing. The discovery of this stone circle, I don't think most of us would dispute that Mike Parker Pearson and his team have found a stone circle, and that in itself is interesting. There aren't many stone circles of that size and type, and it does clearly fit into a pattern, a group of stone circles that we find across the UK, of which there are really not very many, that are literally circular and of quite large size. There's osteological evidence. We've got a lot of cremation burial at Stonehenge throughout the earlier part of the site's history, and there's isotopic data from those remains that suggests that a substantial number of the people who are buried at Stonehenge did not spend the last decade of their life in the area of Stonehenge. Whether that means they as individuals moved, or whether they died somewhere else and their remains were then brought to Stonehenge, we don't know. But I think the latter may be the right answer. The nature of the burials fits with the idea that there are little boxes or bags of cremated remains that are being carried and then buried at Stonehenge. The isotope data don't say to us all these people came from Pembrokeshire or even the Preseli Hills. They say some of them may have come from Pembrokeshire. They also say some of them may have come from all over parts of Britain, and it's quite possible they came from the other side of the Channel, in purely isotopic terms. So it's quite vague. But the suggestion is quite strong, and you look at Stonehenge and you think this isn't something that was built entirely by people who grew up and died within 5 miles of Amesbury. It's a monumental thing that clearly drew people in from a large area. So we'd expect to see far-flung connections, and there are undoubtedly those with Pembrokeshire. Whether or not that indicates some great movement is another issue. I don't think it does.
Yeah, and if I can pick that up with the other sort of evidence of movement of rocks, which is the obvious thing, are Neolithic stone axes, which we know are coming from right across Britain. We're coming from the continent. We've got the jadeite axe we've got in our collections, of course, and lots coming from Devon and Cornwall, Lake District, even Northern Ireland. So we know there are people, those are brought by people, whether it's sort of passed from one village, if you like, to another, or it's one person going all the way to the Lake District to get their bit of rock. We don't know, but there's very good evidence of very long distance contacts.
And one of the other things that we have, thinking about people moving about and exploring the landscape, something that has been picked up on once or twice, has been published a couple of times, but doesn't really feature very much at all in these sorts of discussions, are the other sorts of stone, the other types of stone that are at Stonehenge. And by that, I mean the various types of material that's in the packing stones for uprights at Stonehenge. So it's a really interesting mix, not fabulously well documented, but in Hawley's 1920s excavations, for example, there are lots of different sorts of material, stony, rocky bits being used to pack the sockets for upright stones at Stonehenge. So there's stone that came from around Chilmark, so further south in the county, sort of 15 miles away or so. And there's green sand, and there's oolitic limestone. It's not precisely well enough described for us to get an idea of better locations. But stone that to get, you mostly have to dig a hole in the ground of one sort or another. So not necessarily stone that's just lying about. Obviously, some of it is sarsen stone in particular, because there are cobbles and all sorts of other bits and pieces of sarsen in there too. But yeah, there are these other sorts of stones. So locally, what do we mean by local? What is local stone? And the huge distance from Salisbury Plain to Pembrokeshire contrasts with these much shorter distances of other types of stone that are available a bit more easily, a bit more locally. But what is local? Is it to the horizon or back? Is it the distance you can walk in the day? In which case local is different in the winter than the summer. So I think there are all sorts of interesting questions about how people are moving about the landscape, where they're getting stuff from, where they're getting stone from, what they're doing, what they're using, and how they're getting it as well.
Yeah. Matt, is there anything you want to chip in at this point?
Yeah, well, why not? Yeah, I think the simple answer to that question is no. I'd go further. I'd say there's no evidence to suggest that. What we know is that the bluestones at Stonehenge came from Pembrokeshire. We don't know that any of them came from Weymouth. It's an interesting hypothesis, but that's what it is. It's an interesting hypothesis. It's not been proven. I'm not sure that it could be. It's certainly not the case that a whole extant circle was moved from Pembrokeshire to Wiltshire, because some of the circle is still in Pembrokeshire and the circle in Wiltshire is bigger than the number of stones that came from Pembrokeshire. So there's a whole load more subtlety to whatever it is that's going on between Pembrokeshire and Stonehenge than simply a Stonehenge from Wales came to Wiltshire. I think it's too soon to say what the history of those interactions are. Like Mike's saying, it could have been a process that happened over centuries. It needn't have happened all at once. Some stones could have come from that circle, other stones could have come from somewhere else. There's an awful lot more very interesting research that could be done on that question, which remains to be done, in effect.
I thought one of the interesting things specifically about the Welsh stone circle is that the television film was much more gung-ho than the peer-reviewed article about the idea that this was a second-hand, or that Stonehenge is a second-hand Welsh stone circle. And it doesn't actually say that in the peer-reviewed article, and it recognises a number of difficulties with that theory if you were to propose it. But one of the things I thought was interesting is that the reference was only to Stonehenge. So it was this idea that this bluestone circle moved to Stonehenge. Now, as Matt says, not all the circle moved, and we don't know how many stones there were in it because it hasn't been fully excavated. It's only been partially excavated. But a rough guess would be there were about 25 stones in the circle if the excavated areas are representative of the rest of the ring. And what's curious about that is we do have a putative bluestone circle of about 25 stones down by the River Avon, which Mike Parker-Pearson and his team excavated some years ago, discovered indeed, and part excavated some years ago. So again, that's an estimate, but it is their estimate of about 25 stones. So if you were to look for a location on Salisbury Plain where you took a bluestone circle from Pembrokeshire to Wiltshire, it would be down by the River Avon, not Stonehenge. So somewhere along the line in that television programme, the decision was to focus on Stonehenge and not on this sort of messy, muddy spot down by the river. Now, who knows why? It's like, I mean, I like what Mike Parker-Pearson does with things like this because he generates interest and discussion. And so often what comes out of Mike's work is that there's a lot of disagreement, but there are theories that can be tested out in the field. There are ideas that stimulate further research, excavation, survey, university academic research and so on, and move things forward in an interesting way. So, I mean, I love what he's doing with this Welsh stone circle. I just don't think it stands up, as it were, but it, you know, it's going to lead to one of the things. I think it encourages me more than ever to argue that we need to excavate another Aubrey hole at Stonehenge. We so need that. You know, we're getting, for the second half of the last century, everybody was saying that those the Aubrey holes held nothing. With the big publication of the excavations in 1995, we moved to an idea that they held posts. And Mike Parker-Pearson went back to Colonel Hawley's original hypothesis in the 1920s, and this was the guy who discovered the Aubrey holes, that they did hold bluestones. And I think Mike is probably right, but we just don't have the evidence to really know either way. And we so need a new excavation, and who knows, we might even get something that could allow us to get a decent radiocarbon date, because the Aubrey holes are undated. You know, we can hypothesize quite reasonably, I think, with a reasonable degree of confidence when they were dug, but it is a hypothesis. They're not directly dated.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Now, Andrew has just reminded me that I didn't ask you to introduce yourselves as I should have done. So, who would like to introduce themselves first?
Go on, Katie.
So I'm Katy Whitaker. I am a member of the Society. I work for Historic England, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Reading.
Okay, and Matt?
I'm Matt Leivers. I work for Wessex Archaeology in Salisbury. I am currently involved in the developments of the scheme for the A303.
And you had a small hand in the rebasing project with lots of excavations across the landscape, just beyond Stonehenge.
Indeed, yes, at Lark Hill and Bulford and all of those places was on the edge of the World Heritage Site. Yes, turned out to very
and a small hand in the Stonehenge and Avebury research framework.
That too, yes.
The list could go on.
Publication is on the way as well. Yes, so yeah, the odd bit of work around Stonehenge.
Yeah. Okay, and Mike?
Matt has done probably more field work in the Stonehenge area than any of the rest of us who engage with Stonehenge today. So it's great to have him here. I'm Mike Pitts. I probably joined the Wiltshire Archaeological Society before some of the people listening to us were born. And I directed my first small excavation at Stonehenge in 1979. I co-directed with Mike Parker Pearson and colleagues the re-excavation of an Aubrey hole in 1980, and I've been done various things at Stonehenge over the years. Yeah, so I absolutely love Stonehenge. It's as a place, it just draws in so much because it's such an iconic site. There are few people who in one way or another don't take an interest in it, and so it kind of draws in everything that's happening in society at the time. I imagine it was the case when it was built, but which is interesting in itself, but it's also the case all through recorded history, indeed, and today. And so I just love it as a place where people get together from all over the world and think about antiquity and different cultures, whatever was going on at Stonehenge when it was built, we know it was nothing like anything any of us experience today. And there's something really special, I think, in that kind of communal engagement at that place.
I should probably say a bit about myself as well. So David Dawson, director of the Wiltshire Museum. I was just bowled over by the museum collection when I came on a field trip to see Stonehenge and Avebury and the Wessex landscape. Which is why I decided that was the place I wanted to come to. I'm probably more obsessed by the period after the putting up of the stones, which is an area that's often completely missed out. It wasn't mentioned at all in the TV program, for example. But perhaps it might have been an odd waving of the hand at the barrows in the landscape, but there we are. Okay, back to the questions. There's one that came in advance for Matt specifically, but I think we can definitely widen this out, was whether he often looks at pieces of Preseli bluestone found during excavations in the greater Stonehenge landscape. So is there bluestone elsewhere? Yes.
We don't often find pieces of bluestone, but we do find it. The army basing program excavations that you mentioned, I can't think that we found any on that. The former Ministry of Defence headquarters at Durrington, we did. There was a kind of subcircular, sort of crudely bifacially retouched piece with some grinding to the edges. Came out of the Romana British ditch, if memory serves, but very close to where the late Neolithic post alignment was, so conceivably of that date. Not a huge amount's come out of our excavations recently. I mean, there are Julian Richards on the Stonehenge Environments Project found, I don't know, 20 odd pieces perhaps. So it's there. It's about the place. I think the bit that MOD Durrington might be toward the edge of the extent of the distribution northward that we know of. So it's certainly around, up to the Avon and up to the beyond Durrington walls.
Have you found any in the A303 evaluation work?
Do you know, I was trying to remember, Mike.
Early days, it's post-ex has yet to start, yeah?
When I saw the question come up, I was trying to remember if we have, and I don't think we have. If we have, then it's not very much, it'll be out of the plough zone, but I don't remember there being any. But that doesn't mean there's not, that just means I don't remember.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, the glacier argument is that there's bluestone all over Salisbury Plain, but clearly there isn't.
Mm.
But the fact that you're not finding so much of it in these excavations on the periphery of the World Heritage Site emphasises the distinctive nature of the scatter of bluestone around the west end of the cursus, where there clearly is a concentration, and there has to be some reason why there are all these bits of stone there.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's been suggested that there's a stone circle up by the west end of the cursus in Fargo Wood, just to recap.
There was no, again, a long time ago, and I don't remember very clearly, but I don't remember there being any from around the new Stonehenge Visitor Site, where there's that other proposed site for a small stone circle. Again, I don't remember. There's certainly not a concentration of bluestone like there is at Fargo. So yeah, it's clearly the case that the majority of it is coming from closer to Stonehenge rather than further away from Stonehenge, even in the immediate vicinity. I noticed that there's another part of that question, which is, are they catalogued by Wessex Archaeology? We don't have a specific catalogue of bluestone, but I'm sure that the HER would hold information about pieces of bluestone if it's been identified, and there are certainly the suite of publications that Rob Ixer and various other people have produced over the past decade or so that details that material in some exhaustive detail. So it's certainly there, it's certainly around, but it's not a thing that we encounter frequently certainly not in the excavations that have been done around the periphery of the World Heritage Site at Amesbury Down and the Army Basin Programme sites and things of that sort.
Katie, anything you want to chuck in there?
Well, I suppose the only thing that I might add, mentioned, the finds of bluestone around the landscape tend to be small pieces. There are, obviously, we know the bluestones that we have remaining at Stonehenge itself, some of which show quite significant signs of working. You know, we've got bluestones that were clearly in a kind of a lintel arrangement, and the ones that have got the grooves cut down the sides. And there are a few pieces of bluestone that have come out of the site that show signs of use as an artifact. So as hammerstones, for example, they're not as convincing as hammerstones when you compare them with some of the flint and sarsen hammerstones that are from those same sort of contexts. But it's interesting to think about how this stone is being handled and used and what's happening to it over this really long duration, this really long time scale at the monument. We know the settings are being reset and changed around, and other things are happening at the same time. So are pieces of bluestone accidentally or purposefully coming off stone settings? Have they come into the landscape by some other means? It's interesting to think about when some of this material is when the smaller portable pieces of material are actually becoming available to be used that way and to make their way out somewhere into the landscape, and whether they travel far or not. You know, is the distribution to do with movement in one or other direction, both directions? What actually is the kind of the mechanics behind that?
I find it quite interesting that the bluestones are not used for, axes they're not one of the great axe factories or anything like that, which is quite weird, really. And also bluestone is not generally found in the barrows. There's the theory of the bluestones having healing properties, which sounds great, but I have to say I do expect then to see chips of bluestone in lots of the barrows in the landscape. And there's one or two, but literally it is one or two that we have bluestone. And that is something that Cunnington, who dug most of the barrows, he noted if there was a bit of bluestone in a grave. And then, of course, there's the debate about Bowles Barrow, which is further west on Salisbury Plain, but it's been thought that there's a bluestone
20 hours
in that long barrow, but that's almost certainly not the case. So it really does seem to be concentrated literally around the monument itself. And the other thing that goes with that, and sort of relates back to the first question about looking westwards, is it always strikes me that the focus of the cursus is westwards. You know, archaeologists come from London, don't they? So you sort of think of it, the east, and that's where the sun rises at midsummer, well, at the equinox and all the rest of it. But the cursus, you know, the west end is over the brow of the hill looking westwards, as is the eastern end. So it's very much looking westwards. And I know people have linked that to, there's certainly early Neolithic, the first farmers sort of coming in from Brittany up the Irish Sea, as well as hopping on the Channel Tunnel. So, you know, it's quite an interesting hypothesis is that Stonehenge was in some way on the sort of a neutral ground between those who settled from the west and those who came from the east. Try proving it. Nice story. But there we are. Now on to another question, which Hannah said, are there other examples of relocating stone monuments in prehistoric Britain? Now that had me scratching my head a bit. Looks though it's got us all scratching our heads a bit.
Yeah, I can't think of one. I mean, there's a spectacular example in Brittany, isn't there, of a huge, a huge standing stone that has carvings on it that is broken up and reused in the structure of a massive burial mound. I think one of the problems with that is it's actually, you know, as indeed with the Welsh stone circle, if that did happen, it's very difficult to demonstrate, because it's only really, and certainly in Britain, it's only at Stonehenge that you have stones that are carved. So there's, as Katy mentioned, there are some bluestones at Stonehenge that are carved for a monument that no longer exists. There are a few uprights that were part of possibly trilithons, and we've got 2 lintels. There are so many bluestones missing, there might well have been more. And we don't know where that monument they came from stood, or indeed when, or even if it was at Stonehenge, although we assume, which I think is reasonable to do, we assume it was at Stonehenge, but, you know, arguably it could have been in Wales. Or it could have been down by the River Avon, or somewhere else.
Yeah,
the spacing of the trilithons doesn't. Sorry, Katy.
I was just going to say that all of the examples that I could think of are of course much more recent examples of people taking bits of or whole prehistoric monuments and moving them and using them in other ways. So, for example, in Old Wardour, there's down at Tisbury, there's supposedly a stone circle was taken from Place Farm in the valley and moved up to Old Wardour in the late 18th century as part of the design of that, you know, that late 18th century designed landscape. So there's the grotto in the park, the redesign of the landscape to turn Old Wardour into this amazing sort of eye catcher and scene for the new house and the new property. So there are lots of examples of those sorts of stories. But yes, I couldn't think of anything really obvious from antiquity.
I can't think of a prehistoric example in Britain, but then like Mike said, the difficulty is how you tell, because unless, as with Stonehenge, you're moving stones from geologically foreign locations. It's very, very difficult to demonstrate unless they are decorated somehow. The only example of that I could think of, which isn't prehistoric Britain, I don't think anyway, is potentially on Guernsey, where there's another example of a decorated standing stone potentially being reused as one of the roofing stones of the megalithic chamber. I forget the name of it now, but that's potentially another example of those earlier decorated menhirs being reused later in megalithic chambers. But I certainly don't know of an instance like that in.
The only things I can think of that are sort of relevant is that at West Kennet, one of the stones there has been used as a polissoir for polishing stone axes, but that's on the back of the stone, so it's been relocated. But whether it's been relocated, just sort of stuck upright, or moved 5 miles, there's no way of telling. West Kennet also has Oolitic limestone, so when you go into it, you've got the big sarsens, but the dry stone walling in between is Oolitic limestone, which I think comes from the other side of Bath, so it's been brought some way. And then you think of Newgrange, where there's white quartz and black sort of basalt, if I remember rightly, granite, can't remember, which had come from, I think it's about 80 miles in each direction. So there's more of a tradition of moving stone than you might think, but it's slightly hidden. And I'm not sure how much work has been done on sourcing the stone of megalithic monuments across Britain. You know, whether that's something anyone has actually looked at systematically rather than just by accident when it's blindingly obvious.
I mean, there's an argument that's been advanced occasionally about cut-marked slabs used in kists, slightly later than the period we're dealing with here, as having been somewhere else first. But again, that's equally unprovable, I think, and a slightly different case. But things certainly maintain an importance that can lead to them being taken from where they originally were and put somewhere else and used for some other purpose. I don't think that's an uncommon phenomenon. I think that, as with many things to do with Stonehenge, it's the scale of it that makes it stand out so much in our instance.
I think Katie is quite right to highlight the issue of other non-bluestone rock at Stonehenge, and the chill marks are particularly interesting, because large chunks of them, and they seem to be in only particular pits as well, that are associated with some of the best standing stones. And they don't seem to, I asked Rob Ixay about them the other day, and as far as I can see, he hasn't, Rob and Richard Bevans haven't addressed these non-Welsh stones at Stonehenge. Also, we should remember that there may well have been substantial quantities of timber brought into the area from outside. The amount of wood that will be required, not just to build the timber structures at Darrington Walls and Woodhenge, and who knows, other sites, but also for use in construction of Stonehenge itself. The amount of timber must have been absolutely massive, and the ecological data we have suggests that the immediate landscape would not have been capable of generating that wood. And some of the posts or the tree boles at Woodhenge and Darrington Walls were absolutely enormous and would have to have come from quite mature forests, and who knows where that might have come from.
On the chat, Heather Sabir from English Heritage, who certainly knows her stuff. It's quite terrifying doing this, because you see sort of see the list of some of the people, and you think how much they know. Who knows the Channel Islands very well? She said Le Dehus in Guernsey has a possible decorated menhir incorporated into the tomb. I think that's the one you mentioned, Matt. And Le Hugby has lots of different geologies associated with it. Amazing monument, that one, very much in the sort of Breton style of things. Okay, so let's go on. We've got a question from Catherine. Have there been any anthropological studies of comparable technologically equivalent groups of people in relation to landscape and landscape statements like Stonehenge. An example like the Australian songlines, which are a completely oral record.
Anybody?
Well, Mike Parker Pearson and is it Ramillis Thunina? Is that how you pronounce his name? Their original hypothesis about what Stonehenge was for and that whole living dead kind of arrangement of the landscape is based on an anthropological analogy from Madagascar, leaving aside any notion about technological equivalence or any of those kinds of things. But I mean, anthropological analogy has been one of the key tools in archaeologists' kit bags for decades, as a way of thinking about how other societies organise themselves and interact with landscapes and things of this sort. So I mean, the obvious one in terms of Stonehenge is that one. It's the PP&R, as they call it in their book, that hypothesis that stone means ancestors and timber means living people, to oversimplify it. I'm sure there are numerous others, but that's the one that immediately springs to mind.
There has been, on slightly less ethereal level, there are still people, still is the wrong word, there are people quarrying and moving and erecting megaliths in various places around the Indian Ocean and Indonesia today. Mike Parker Pearson has himself, as Matt mentioned, has studied some of this going on in Madagascar. I've been to Madagascar myself and seen some of these sites. They are utterly extraordinary. There's terrifically interesting things happening in Indonesia. There's a Canadian archaeologist called Ron Adams who recently completed a PhD studying the construction of what we would call tombs. What we would call, my mind's gone blank. I'll forget that bit. Of megalithic tombs, you know, with the capstone slabs around the side, these sort of earlier Neolithic tombs that we see in Britain and Northwest Europe. And that work there on one island in particular, Sumba, where these tombs are quite regularly built. And what's useful and interesting there for our studies here is the insights that you get from seeing these people do these things, from the technology of construction, of how they do this. And generally as Mike Parker Pearson has shown in Madagascar, what we see today tells us is that most of our ideas about how Stonehenge and other stone circles and megalithic tombs were built, that we see in print, simplify things on the one hand, in that they're trying to make the project really efficient and achievable with the smallest number of people and materials. And on the other hand, they make them more complex by focusing too much on engineering and actually underestimating the abilities of people who would have done these things. And if we look at other aspects that we know quite well of Neolithic Britain, particularly from areas like the Somerset Levels and other areas where there have been waterlogged wood has been excavated, recovered, and elsewhere at this time, or even earlier Neolithic elsewhere in Europe, we can see these guys were clearly quite sophisticated carpenters. And the sort of sledge that we see, say, at the visitor centre at Stonehenge, which is a couple of logs placed on a few logs, is probably underestimating what these people were really doing, and that they were capable, as we see today on somewhere like Sumba, of really making sophisticated constructions to move stones. And then when they did so with very large numbers of people, simply because it's something that everybody wants to enjoy taking part in, rather than wanting to stay at home and leave the minimum number of poor people who've got to shoulder all this weight. Actually, we want to get out there and party and enjoy it, and in a sense, sort of end up owing, having their labour owed to them by the people who are organising the project, setting up future credit and debts and so on. There's all sorts of complicated social stuff going on around the construction of these monuments. And I think we're missing a great deal if we focus just on megaliths, on earthworks, and on minimal attempts to engineer these structures. And I think that's one of the really big lessons we learn from looking at people today engaging in technologically similar exercises.
Yeah.
If I can just pick up on that point, it's always struck me that Dave Field and Jim Leary, when they're talking about Silbury Hill, made the point that they might not have been constructing something in the sense of, you know, you got a blueprint from the architect and you go off and build it. It may well have been about it was the very act of construction, the very act of bringing, sort of getting involved was what they were doing. The actual thing they were building was a byproduct.
Yeah.
It's a very different way of looking at it.
Yeah, this is what Colin Richards in his book Building the Great Stone Circles of the North writes about. He's got a whole chapter in that book, which came out in 2013, I think it was, about this very question, and that actually it's not about, or using the anthropological analogy, it's not about this act of engineering and how sort of efficient or architectural can you make it, but it's about the people coming together to do the work. And he talks about risk, the risk involved in undertaking this incredible enterprise, and how obligated people become in the process of doing this work. And he describes a story where from the anthropological evidence, the ethnographic evidence, where there is a character who has engaged a whole lot of people to be involved in one of these events, moving a great stone, and it fails. And the reason it fails is because the people that he has involved in doing it let it fail, because they and I forget exactly the details, but for some reason they don't respect this person who has set this whole thing up in the first place, and so they let this event fail. And it's part of these social relationships and these really personal relationships between individuals that matter and decide what it is that happens, whether the event is going to be successful or not. So it's a fascinating read. I'll put the reference to that. I'll put the reference to that in the chat, because the book is available. It's Windgather Press. Yeah, Building the Great Stone Circles of the North, and there's a whole chapter in there that talks about that.
Yeah, the idea of failure with these things is really interesting, because we look at what we've got now, and we assume that that's the remains of the intention of the people that built it, and we don't take into account, you know, the fact that building something like Stonehenge or Silbury Hill is contingent and messy and can go wrong, and involves forces beyond your control, whether you think they're spiritual forces or they're mechanical forces or whatever they might be, and the thing that you're trying to do might be unachievable, or you might be 3/4 of the way to achieving it, and then something happens that means you achieve something else, and all of those slips and accidents and failures, if you want to call them that, get incorporated into what it is that you're doing and have a knock-on effect on what you do next. So, you know, we look at Stonehenge, we go, it's perfect circle, and it's all the lintels are nice and flat, and isn't that a marvel of architecture? But who's to say that it was ever complete in that state anyway? You know, was the outer circle of sarsens ever finished? You know, there's the short one, isn't there? Reach. You know. So I think by looking at the thing and going, there's the mental image of the thing that these people set out to make, we miss a whole lot about what it was that happened in the process of the making of them. And that's, you know, people are the interesting things in archaeology, you know, just as much as the things they're making. So trying to get at that is really interesting.
Okay. Now, if I can sort of change tack slightly, this is a question that was sent in earlier, so quite a long question. So Katie had a chance to look at it, so I'll put you on the spot with this one, which is about the sarsens, really, whether there's field opportunities relating to the sarsens that people might get involved in, and where then the research has been going on into the use of sarsen in building stone and distribution. I think Katie is quite well placed to answer that one somehow.
Yeah, so you're going to have to, because there's kind of two parts to that really. You're going to have to remind me of the bit that I don't answer first, because by the time I've spoken, I've forgotten where I'm going. So the question
memory
about
of a goldfish, like some of us. Yeah.
Memory of a goldfish. So the question about kind of field opportunities to get involved with sarsen stones. First of all, should we talk about that first of all? So it kind of depends what thing you have in mind. Obviously, if you want to go out and explore and look and see, look at and see sarsen stones, you've got huge opportunities to do that when the regulations allow and when it's safe to do so in the county, and not only in Wiltshire. But let's talk about Wiltshire first of all. So, if you want, you can get yourself an Ordnance Survey Land Ranger map at 1 to 25,000, and you can go and visit. And I would recommend Piggledene and the Valley of Stones, of course, in particular. Go up onto the National Nature Reserve on the Marlborough Downs and follow the footpaths, and have a look at how the stones are distributed across the landscape on the chalk hills. And take a close look at them. I mean, take in that beautiful view, but take a close look at the individual stones and have a look at the lichen and the moss that's growing on them, and have a look at the amazing, weird and wonderful shapes that they grow in, and get a feel for what the stones really are like and what it's like being out there. You can go into West Woods, of course. There's really good access that the Forestry Commission makes available to get into West Woods, the car parks, and really well maintained woodland rides around West Woods. And if you go at the right time of year, which really needs to be the winter before there's much overgrowth, then you should find some sarsens scattered about the woods and get a feel for what it's like in that kind of what today is a more enclosed sort of a landscape because of the forestry, because of the way that West Woods has been developed and tended over the years. If you want to go a bit further afield, again, when the rules allow, you can go down to Dorset and the Valley of Stones in Dorset and have a look around Portisham. And you can even see sarsen stones, not so many, but you can see sarsen stones on the surface in Kent, in the Medway Valley as well, and go and have a look at the sarsen-built monuments like Kit's Coty, for example, and Coldrum Long Barrow, Chambered Long Barrow. So there are lots of opportunities to see stones lying out and about in the countryside, in the form of monuments as well. And of course, really importantly, as buildings, as much more recent structures, not only in Wiltshire, but quite frankly, I mean, all over the place. If you happen to find yourself in Pirbright, go and have a look at the church tower. It's a late 18th century church tower, and it's absolutely beautiful, made of cut sarsen blocks. They're beautifully dressed, amazing. If you go to High Wycombe, go and have a look at the the streets of High Wycombe, and Aylesbury. Have a look at the streets of Aylesbury. Go to Marlow and have a look at Marlow Old Town Hall, which was built in 1806, and it's made of beautifully cut and dressed sarsen blocks from the sarsen stones on the Chiltern Hills. So depending on what you're interested in seeing and what you'd like to go and have a look at, there's a lot out there that you can do.
And I think someone's been doing some work recently on the distribution of sarsens, if I'm not wrong.
Do you mean
for
me,
their
David?
PhD thesis?
So sarsen stone, the type of stone that sarsen is this stuff called silcrete, so that includes sarsen and also pudding stones like Hertfordshire pudding stone. You find it across southern, sort of central and eastern England, all the way from Devon all the way across to Norfolk. You can go onto Hayling Beach and you'll see sarsen stone boulders lying on Hayling Beach, because they have this broad distributed kind of spread, where they're either on the surface in surface scatters, or they're in the superficial geological deposits. So that's why, for example, there are so many in the Chiltern Hills, because the Chiltern Hills, unlike the Marlborough Downs, they have really thick deposits of clay with flints and brick earth, and these other clays and sands lying on top of the chalk hills. And there are sarsen stones full of, those deposits are full of sarsen stone boulders. So they are all over.
What I'm trying to get you to say, Katy, is you've done a little bit of work on this and you've published one or two things.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Also open access as well. Yeah. So you can have a look at the article that I published in the Antiquaries Journal, which I don't immediately have a link to, but I will find it. So that's also open access. There was a project in the 1970s. We could talk about these projects. There's a project in the 1970s called the Sarsen Stones in Wessex project, which covered Wiltshire, Dorset and Hampshire, looking for the presence of sarsen stones. And lots of people have done this over the years. There was a project earlier on in the 50s, and that was in Buckinghamshire, Hertfordshire, bit of Oxfordshire and Berkshire, did a similar thing, trying to plot the positions of sarsen stones. And this project in the 70s did it for Dorset, Hampshire and Wiltshire as well, plotting the positions. And that data is all available as archive material, which I pulled together and created a new data set of. And that's I've written about that in the last year's Antiquaries Journal. So yeah, I'll make sure I put a link to that.
Yeah, that's great. If you can put those in the chat, that'd be fabulous. And also, yeah. Katy, you gave a talk at our archaeology conference, which once I've finished editing, then we'll start putting those up. So keep an eye out for the for your talk on about it there. That was fabulous.
Grand.
Now moving on, because it's almost past, so I think we've got time for one, possibly two more questions. One from Tim, and I had to get him to explain what this is because I had no idea what it was. Do you think excavating Hawley's graves would answer many of these lithic questions? Now, Tim says that this is where Hawley gathered up the packing stones that had to be removed when they set the stones in concrete, and he buried them somewhere. But I didn't know that. Do you think that would be a fun thing to do?
I do. I don't think it'll answer many questions, but it will certainly answer some. The Hawley's graves were, what happened is, as he excavated, most of his finds were stored in a couple of sheds, sort of army-like buildings just south of the monument. And they stood there for some time after he finished excavating. And it was only when the Office of Works was starting to get embarrassed about the state of them, and they were worried about them being a bit of an eyesore, that they were taken down. And most of their contents were buried in pits further south, which are easy to locate. We can see them in air photographs, and of course they show up in geophysics. The only things that were retrieved from that we know of were the cremation burials, which were saved by Robert Ewell and stored in his attic until eventually he passed them on. Those graves, we don't know really what's in them. We assume that it's mostly rock debris, and not just packing stones, but as Katy has mentioned, there's a lot of other debris, fresher debris at Stonehenge, and so there will be a lot of presumably broken megaliths. Some of those breakages will have been really quite recent, but there's no reason to think that some of them are actually quite ancient. And at the very least, having that debris will give us an idea of what Hawley was selectively saving. In other words, what is now in our, will enable us to judge what's now in our museum collections of the stone debris from Stonehenge, how representative it is of actually what he dug up. But it'll also provide a lot more samples for Richard Bevins and Rob Ixo, who must be starting to wonder what they're going to do, having spent a decade analysing the stuff and getting now towards the end of that project. And that should keep them going for another decade. And it's likely that amongst all that debris, they could, one day somebody could actually identify yet another type of bluestone, if not more. But there could be other material as well. There could be bone antler, who knows? But definitely, well, I mean, it would be so easy to do. And we may, one may end up reburying a lot of it if there's too much of it, but definitely worth doing. But it's not going to answer all the questions.
Okay. And question, I think this one probably for Matt. The circle of recently identified shafts around Durrington is that a complete? Do you think that's a complete circle, or is the eastern arc of shafts that would complete the circle not actually there?
I'm inclined to think that, assuming that that's is actually real and can be demonstrated to be real in the fullness of time, then I think that the eastern side of it is probably the river. I doubt that it ever. I say that there's no real reason to doubt it, but I doubt that it extended over to the eastern side of the Avon. I would imagine that it ran down to the Avon and stopped, because everything else does, more or less, at that time. That's where the Durrington Walls Avenue goes, where the Stonehenge Avenue goes. It's where our Dry Valley from Lark Hill goes. Everything references the Avon. So I would think that if this giant arc of things is a chronologically coherent set of things, then it probably did the same thing.
You've excavated some, haven't you?
And I think I'm right that you.
Yes. Were you going to ask the same thing?
Exactly what I was going to say.
At MOD Durrington, there were 2. At Lark Hill, there were 4 inside the excavation area, maybe 6 in total. So we've positively identified, I think, 8, either through geophysical survey or surface survey or trial trenching or coring or things of this sort. We didn't fully excavate any of them right the way down to the bottoms of them, because some of them are monstrously big and the people that were going to build houses on them weren't very keen. Was opening 20-meter diameter building sites for any other number of reasons. But yes, we've investigated over half of the northern arc that we encountered in our excavations at MOD Durrington and Lark Hill. Yes, and the ones that we have all appear to be solution hollows. They're geological features, some with alterations of the tops, uses of the top of the weathering cones, the massive parts at the top. They narrow down very rapidly. They're funnel shaped. They're wide, shallow funnel shaped things that go down to central solution pipes that are much narrower and much deeper. But the tops of several had evidence of having been utilised in various points in prehistory and indeed in the Roman period. One of them, some as repositories for rubbish, others as places for deposition of napping debris. And the thing as a whole appears to have been a focus for other kind of activities, as a cremation burial from the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age kind of period, inserted into the line between the enormous features of MOD Durrington, and then of course the corded enclosure on Lark Hill appears to be built across the line with its entrance aligned along the line of the things. So they were clearly of considerable significance, even if they're geological things themselves, or some of them geological things themselves, because many of them haven't been investigated at all and could be anything.
Okay, we've got. I think we probably really ought to be on the last question, but I can give you a choice. We've got Mesolithic stuff, or we've got the peri-glacial stripes on the avenue. Hands up for the peri-glacial stripes amongst the panel.
I'd go for peri-glacial stripes. It's not really my thing, but
hands up for Mesolithic and Blickmead.
I could do with either. I don't mind.
Okay. Let's go for Mesolithic, and the question, which I've now just lost because it was in the chat. Any update on the excavations at Blickmead and there's the concerns over the tunnel affecting the site?
In a way, that's two separate questions, because there hasn't been a lot of, as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot more excavation at Blickmead recently, and we're awaiting the full analysis and publication of what has been done at the site. So it's difficult to say much about it, despite the hyperbole that's been in the media, until we see the full analysis of the site. On the question of the road, that all indications are, and it's been thoroughly researched, that if the road tunnel is to go ahead, then the Blickmead site wouldn't be affected by it. That's my take.
Okay. Oh, that was very snappy. Matt, Katie, anything to add?
I mean, all I know is that since the monograph came out, analysis of their material has been ongoing, and there are some interesting results coming out of that, but none of them are in the public domain yet, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah. The thing I'd like to add on that is that there are a whole range of other Mesolithic sites up and down the Avon and across the Stonehenge landscape. And there are evidence of Mesolithic settlement under barrows and all sorts. So if you just sort of see all the press, you'd think there was no evidence of anyone else living in the landscape at the time, when in fact there's people all over the place. I think that's something that people don't quite twig. For example, at Stonehenge, there was a quite substantial flint scatter just to the north of the Henge monument. Possibly even the Henge may well have cut into it, but you don't hear about that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Particularly if you go further south, just south of Salisbury, on the River Avon, the same river, in the early 60s, a Mesolithic settlement was excavated in Downton, the village of Downton, where, by all accounts, there's better preservation than there is at Blickmead. And a larger area was excavated, and they found evidence for structures, for houses, and better preservation of bone animal remains than we've got at Blickmead, and more lithic material. So there are clearly going to be other sites like that all along the river. It's a hugely untapped resource, and there's massive potential. It's very exciting, really. The potential for understanding that hunter-gatherer landscape is huge, not least thanks to that river valley.
But of course, it's in the floodplain where no building takes place, therefore very little excavation.
Yeah,
because
excavation
happens where there's going to be development these days.
It is a big contrast, isn't it, with the Kennet Valley and the research on the Mesolithic in the Kennet Valley in the north of the county. It's such a contrast, and yeah, definitely an area for more work. Yeah, so I wrote once in British Archaeology in the Kennet Valley, around Newbury. That's fantastic Mesolithic sites, dozens of them with terrific preservation over a very long span. A lot of excavation, a lot of it occasioned by the extension of a sewage farm. And and I wondered why that sewage farm work didn't get the attention that a small Mesolithic site did, just happened to be near Stonehenge. But there we go. But very similar location to Blickmead, on River Valley, with woodland on the upland, chalk downland around, and so on. Really interesting.
Okay, let's 30 seconds on the peri-glacial stripes at the as well. So that from Janine, much is made of the orientation of the peri-glacial striations being a reason for the location of Stonehenge. Is the orientation of striation in other areas of the plain the same, or is it just a coincidence? Katie?
Well, so I'm not sure if off the top of my head, this is where we need somebody who's probably on the, I don't know if Martin Barber's on the call, who's looked at more aerial photographs of Salisbury Plain than I have. So I'm not 100% sure how the geological characteristics of the landscape, Matt probably has a comment on this, compares from that location there, aligned with the avenue alignment, compares with other locations across the plain. But clearly the relationship between geological features in the landscape and archaeological sites, the people engaging with these geological sites, is something that's important not only in this area but across the country and elsewhere. So you see it at Grimes Graves, for example, in Norfolk. You know, these amazing Neolithic flint mines, and there are also periglacial stripes and periglacial features in the landscape there. You can sort of see a relationship between Grimes Graves and the geological features. Matt mentioned sinkholes attracting attention, the tops of the sinkholes attracting attention and being used for different sorts of deposits or activity. This is something that Sue Greeny, who many of you will know, Sue Greeny's PhD thesis is looking at, which it will be submitted for examination shortly, and you know, at some point will be available. I'm sure she'll publish on that too. So it is really significant, people's relationships with their landscape, that these sorts of geological features show up.
I think with the Stonehenge Avenue examples, the argument that was advanced wasn't simply that they were there and on that orientation. It was that they were unusually large, so they may have had an expression on the surface of some sort, and that they were associated with ridges in the chalk that were also natural. And it was the combination of these things that led to Stonehenge being located where it was, because these geological formations coincidentally pointed toward midsummer sunrise. So I think rather than it simply being the fact that they existed, it was the fact that they existed in unusual form and in combination with other unusual geological features, and it was the combination of things together that was supposed to be what made the location significant, and its coincidence with the astronomical phenomenon. Whether there are similar instances elsewhere in the locality or elsewhere on the plain, I don't know, but it was that, I think, that was the argument made for the ones underneath the avenue.
Mike, would you like to add anything?
I may be the only person who's not convinced by this avenue argument. I don't know whether there are other skeptics out there. I mean, I think we really need, in the Stonehenge landscape, some work done by geomorphologists who are familiar with chalk peri-glacial structures. And that, you know, I think, to be fair, I think that hasn't yet happened. I mean, for example, you know, the great pits that Matt was talking about, that we recognize are natural, but we don't really understand them. We don't know, as archaeologists, we can't say why these pits occur there and why in particular they seem to occur in this giant circle, this great ring, or indeed whether they do, whether further survey would identify other pits that show, in fact, there's a wider scatter. As an archaeologist who's excavated on the chalk, I'm not convinced by the peri-glacial structure argument for the strange phenomenon of these lines going down the avenue. They look, on the one hand, it looks to me like special pleading to say that what most of us took to be remains of the bank, of the chalk banks either side of the avenue, are actually natural geomorphological features, and on the other hand, that gullies that run down the center of the avenue are some kind of peri-glacial structure, and that I've never seen peri-glacial structures that look like that in the geological literature anywhere. And Katy mentioned Grimes Graves, which has the most fantastic polygons, peri-glacial rings and lines and stuff all over it, and really fabulous. In fact, as much of Norfolk and Suffolk do. And I've never seen anywhere there linear features in the form that we're supposed to see at Stonehenge. You know, they're braided, they're networked, they're rings and polygons, and yes, they stretch out down slopes, but there are slopes at Grimes Graves where they stretch out, but they still retain polygonal form rather than extend into continuous lines. And there, as well as these linear peri-glacial structures so described going down the avenue, there are also similar features that are described as wheel ruts. And I think archaeologically, it's difficult to disentangle those. And I think, you know, we need some more analysis there. It's a really interesting idea. And there are clearly things that we don't, I think, at the moment fully understand about that avenue, earthwork and the various features associated with it. And yet again, you know, it's a cause, I think, for more research, more fieldwork.
Mm.
Martin Barber is on the call, and he said Fiona Small is the answer. She's looked at the photos. There are two other things I wanted to say. One is that I'm always struck by Dave Field's suggestion in one of the English Heritage Research reports that there could have been a clump of sarsens up where Stonehenge is today, and that could have been part of that focus. And there was something else which has escaped me completely, so I'll have to wait for another time.
Well, I put forward this idea that before Mike came up with the avenue thing. So of course I could be accused of having a vested interest in my skepticism, but I put forward the suggestion that the solar alignment, the solstice alignment, was naturally contained in two natural sarsens at Stonehenge, one of which is the Heelstone, and the other of which would have been in a massive pit near the center of the site that isn't fully explained, but is similar, excuse me, is similar in size to the huge pit beside the Heelstone, which I partially excavated, and I now think might well have been a natural hollow in which the Heelstone lay. And those two pits are on that solstice alignment. So if they both had massive sarsens in them, in a landscape that is largely bereft of sarsens, then they would have really stood out. Now, of course, Dave Nash and his team from Brighton are now arguing that there weren't any sarsens of the size of the Heelstone on Salisbury Plain, and their analysis suggests that the Heelstone came from West Woods, which frankly I find difficult to credit, but you know, the research is ongoing.
I think there has to have been something at Stonehenge before Stonehenge. What that was, who knows? It's probably unanswerable now, given the amount of mucking about there's been in the middle of Stonehenge over the centuries. But I think there has to have been something there. Yeah.
One thing I'd spotted that I think has been picked up, I'm not sure if anyone had picked it up first, so I'm not claiming credit for this, is that some of the pine charcoal dates at Stonehenge, sort of from the monument, some of that pine charcoal dates to 8000 BC, so it's the same date as the car park pits. So whether there were posts up there as well is another possibility. But as you say, Matt, the chance of, well, need decent excavation up there, which ain't going to happen anytime soon. So
well, for anybody who's particularly interested in the sort of geological side of the peri-glacial landforms, I've just put in the chat a reference to a really good book by geomorphologists about exactly what in Britain these sorts of features, peri-glacial features, are, what they look like, how they form, what the some of the most recent geological understanding is on this very topic. I'm not sure how accessible the volume is for many. I'm sure Interlibrary Loan would find it. There's a copy in, well, there's a copy in the Historic England Library at Swindon. I'm pretty sure when that's open again. I think that there's a copy of it there as well. But yeah, if you do want to chase up the current geological understanding of periglacial landforms, then Merton and Ballantyne 2017 is the book to go to.
Brilliant. Maybe we ought to put that on the list for our library.
Yeah.
As long as it's relatively inexpensive.
So lots of good illustrations, really helpful.
Oh, good. I always like pictures.
Yeah,
helps me understand the rest of it. That's fantastic. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Mike, Matt, and Katy for what for me has been a really interesting talk. I hope it has for those people who've been listening. Quite frightening to see the names of some of the people who have joined us. I hope you've enjoyed it, and a very big thanks again. Yeah, it's not to look. I'm so glad I had your help and support. I couldn't have done that. I really couldn't have done that on my own. So 20 people perhaps, but not that lot. Absolutely fascinating. So a very big thank you, and see some of you on Wednesday when we hear from Tom Booth about the sort of Bronze Age burials, and I think also about the latest on beaker DNA in the landscape. Okay, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Katie, are you still there?
Yeah, I am.
Can I ask you a question? As you're
Yeah,
still
of course.
Oh, yeah.
About
Remember,
sarsens.
if you remember, we're still live. We've
Yeah,
got,
okay. Right. I'm just going to ask Katie a
16
question and then
16
move on.
people listening at
Okay.
the moment.
All right. Sarsen is usually described as being really hard.
Yes.
And there's this big issue about how the sarsen stones were dressed at Stonehenge. And yet at the same time, there's this undercurrent of this idea that when sarsen is freshly excavated from the ground, it can be quite soft and sugary. I've never seen this. I've heard lots of people tell me this, but I've never actually seen it. Have you? Have you seen sugary, sort of soft, crumbly sarsen?
Yes, but not in those circumstances. So it's such an interesting topic. So once the boulders have formed, once they've gone through this silicification process, which for our part of the world, they're probably groundwater silcretes, given what we can tell from the boulders and what we can tell from the landforms and the history of the landforms, the geomorphology. So the boulders form and they're still buried, and they weather underground just as they weather when they're out on the surface. So chemical processes are constantly ongoing. They don't just form and then that's it. They're always changing, albeit slowly. But so, for example, this is the issue with iron oxide. So iron oxide, it's really mobile and can move. It can move in water. It can move through the stone, and so you get the coloration. You start to get the browns and all the way through to the oranges and the reds. And this is happening underground and on the surface, depending on where the boulders are. So first of all, there's that's happening now. When the idea then that it's only when they're exposed to the air that they are then going to experience the kind of weathering that really indurates them and makes them really hard, so they're going to be really different to when they have been buried, is it's not going to geochemically it's not going to be as simple as that, because weathering happens underground just like it happens out of the ground. Now, sarsen contains a lot of water, so it's quartz sand cemented by silica, but there's pore water. There's lots of water in this whole in the structure. So when you if you burn sarsen, a lot of that water is driven away, and that's when you get this much more powdery, crumbly stuff that you can just sort of turn to dust in your fingers. You know, it's really dramatically different if when sarsen's gone through that process, you can tell and you can see that. And but sarsen being softer when it's freshly dug out of the ground compared with when it hasn't, if that happens, then it's a matter of degrees. So just like Bath stone or Tottenham stone, one of the freestones, they come out of the quarry, they're full of quarry sap, they're green stone, they work differently to when they've been weathered and been out in the air. Clearly that happens to some extent with any kind of rock, and it will happen with the sarsens, but it's a question of degree. Like, there's a real big difference between Bath stone that's straight out of the ground and Bath stone that's been out in the yard for a year. Really different. Is sarsen stone that much different from when it's been underground to when it's not? We don't know, because nobody's actually done the kind of geochemical analysis of freshly dug out of the ground buried sarsen compared with the same material that's then been left out for a year or for a number of years. I mean, I think it's intriguing. It's intriguing. We have these long-standing reports of this. You know, this is what the stone is like. It's really easy to work when it first comes out of the ground, and not when it hasn't. But you know, the 18th, 19th century stonecutters who were splitting sarsens that had been buried on the Chiltern Hills compared with the same people who are doing exactly the same thing in Wiltshire, and they're doing it on stones that are on the surface. They're both equally successful industries. You know, they're really skilled guys. They know their stuff. They know what they're doing. They can process the stones, and they can make tons, hundreds of tons of product every year of street furniture and building blocks and all the rest of it. So, that's, you know, that should be really different sarsen in a way. The stuff that's come out of the ground in the Chilterns compared with what's on the surface here, but it doesn't stop them doing exactly the same exactly the same work on the boulders. So yeah, it's
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and
Jules
Jill
on the line.
Swanton has just said,
Yeah.
Julian Richards and I dug one out years ago. Sorry, that's now just disappeared for me.
It was not very deep, but it was very hard. Yes.
Not very deep, but it was very hard. Yeah.
But you see,
but
you know, if you.
But Tim Dorr had a block of sarsen that we did a little video of, because it was one he picked up from Westwards, and that was quite crumbly.
Yeah.
So,
but you see, equally, you know, some of them are better silicified than the others. When that process is happening underground, you know, that's part of the reason why so many of them have all the kind of knobbles and lumps and bumps and holes and all the rest of it in them, is because the sands that are being cemented together by the silica, that's happening variably throughout the underground, the buried deposits. So you could get I mean, there's even, I forget, is it in one of Donald Free's articles that he wrote in WAM, and he talks about it is possible to split open a sarsen and to have free sand that runs out of a hole in the middle. I think it's in one of Donald Free's papers. So he published two. They're almost identical, 1948 and 1950 in WAM. The sand and pebble beds that the silica is moving through, and then precipitating and gluing the sand together, that's happening variably. And then, of course, all the erosion that comes after, over the millions of years afterwards, that's then moving away the uncemented material. So there's all sorts of things to put into the mix. You could have poorly cemented sarsen in the first place. You could have really well cemented sarsen, but depending on the process that's happening underground or overground, that's going to have a slightly different effect on different boulders. But then, if you know your materials and if you know your tools, you can do anything. And that's true of prehistory and also of the post-medieval industry as well. So I'm fascinated by the story, because it seems to me that the story of the stone being easier to work, whether it's been buried or not, it's one of those tropes that sarsen stone can't be cut with iron tools. That's one of the other stories that's often repeated. Well, clearly they can, because there's a whole industry, a number of generations that's based on being able to cut sarsen with metal tools. And that has its origins in something that Rastel published in 1530. And if you actually read the whole thing that he published, it doesn't say the sarsen can't be cut with iron tools. It says that the sarsen can't be cut with iron tools except with great business, meaning with a lot of effort, with the skill, with the know-how. Sarsen stones in Hampshire under churches have to have been from stone circles that have pagan stone circles that have been Christianized in building them into the churches. That's often repeated back at me if I do like a presentation or a lecture to a community group. That's often one of the things that people will think of and know about sarsens, and it gets repeated back at me. Well, if that's the case, Hampshire had a huge number of stone circles, all of which have gone and are now under churches and has no other megalithic monuments left, so yeah, I'm going on too much, but I'm enthusiastic about it, obviously.
Sorry, I didn't want to keep you up, but I think it's interesting, really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, that's been absolutely fabulous, especially the extra time, as they say, if you listen to BBC podcasts.
Okay.
So I think we'll call it a day there. We'll need a cup of tea or whatever.
Okay.
Top up the glass of wine. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Lovely to see you all. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye now.